how long is he prepared to let this run? It's a very good question. He is so mercurial and unpredictable. He could suddenly take against Putin if he felt Putin was jerking him around and not taking him seriously. And we might find a bit as with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. He went to Pyongyang, he hoped to land a big shiny deal, didn't quite work out, and then he immediately veered away from Kim Jong-un, who became public enemy after that. And of course, Putin's trying to avoid that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Lord Peter Ricketts, a British diplomat for 40 years and the UK's National Security Advisor from 2010 to 2012. Lord Ricketts, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Louis.
We've just had this announcement from British Prime Minister Keir Starmer on the coalition of the willing countries who could send troops to Ukraine. He said that they will move to an operational phase. How significant is that announcement?
I think it is Keir Starmer trying to keep the ball rolling on this initiative, which he started 2 weeks ago at that London summit, which he pulled together the first group of the coalition of the willing. I think now it's got a little wider. I think countries like Canada and Australia are part of it, so it goes beyond Europe. And I think he wants to show the Americans in particular, as well as Zelensky, that he is moving forward with this idea. What moving to an operational phase means to me is that the ball is now in the court of the military chiefs to work out in much greater detail what the support from European countries and others would be. I mean, that is, I'm sure, in terms of equipment, in terms of training, mentoring, but also the possibility of putting some kind of boots on the ground in what is now being called a reassurance force. That is much more tricky, to my point of view, because the Russians would certainly oppose it. Indeed, I think they'll try and write into a ceasefire that there should be no NATO troops deployed in Ukraine. So it depends on Trump to see that off. But even if he does, I think it'll need to be very carefully planned what actually a force like that would do. It clearly won't go into direct confrontation with the Russians along a front line. That would be very dangerous. But even if it's in the background, there is always going to be a risk of a clash with the Russians, engineered by them, perhaps deniable, but nonetheless intended to humiliate the force. That's why Keir Starmer is so keen on what he calls a backstop. I would call the undertaking of strategic support from the Americans, both while the force was deploying, but also if it got into trouble to come to the rescue. I think it's unlikely that Trump is going to give that guarantee personally. So I'm not sure we're going to see a force in the end, but I think it's entirely right that the Europeans should gear up so that they're able to move if the circumstances are right.
And Trump has, so far used that language himself as well, hasn't he? He's backed the idea of what he has called a peacekeeping force. So you're not sure he will stick to that if push comes to shove?
Well, I mean, I think he's happy that other people should take the risks and get involved in Ukraine if they want to. But the British and the French and others have been clear from the outset that this will only work with American support. Why? Because if it doesn't have full-hearted American support, Putin will be bound to try to, if not attack the force frontally, sabotage, assassination, try and interrupt and interfere with the force's activities, and bring to the point where European countries begin to fear a direct clash with the Russians, which clearly nobody wants. But it remains a possibility as long as there isn't an absolutely clear American support. Because in Ukraine, even if they're in the background, if they're around Kiev rather than on the front line, Russian missiles, drones are hitting all over Ukraine. And I think it would be a brave European leader who put their forces into that situation without being absolutely sure that the Americans provided a safety net effectively and deterred the Russians by making clear that they would come in if anything happened to the force. That's going to be the crunch point. But I think what's going on now with this operational phase is making sure the Europeans have a credible offer ready, planned, prepared, so that they could move if the circumstances were right.
And Keir Starmer has said that Putin's yes but approach is not good enough to the idea of a ceasefire, even if that's short term or long term, we're not sure yet. Is that attitude likely to be reflected in Washington? And short of this peacekeeping force, whatever that may be, what more should Europe do if it wants to pressure Putin into ceasefire talks?
We're at a very interesting point, Louis, I think, as we have this conversation, in that Zelensky has been entirely clear he's up for a short 30-day ceasefire to allow time for the detail to be worked through for a longer term peace settlement. Putin, of course, hates the idea of a short term ceasefire. He thinks that would give advantage to Ukraine. Ukraine has been under pressure, falling back, and to have a ceasefire would be a help to Ukraine at a time when they're in difficulties. Equally, he can't say directly no to Trump. I mean, he believes that he's got this relationship with Trump, looks from the outside that he has, and he doesn't want to kill that by being entirely negative. So, of course, he's come up with yes, but, and the buts are all designed to make it impossible for Zelensky to agree. So it's a sort of game of bluff now. Each of the sides wants to try and paint the other as the obstacle to peace, and all that lands up on Trump's desk. He's the one who's listened to the Russians. His staff have listened to the Ukrainians. Now they've got to try and work out, where they go next. The risk, of course, is there'll be a direct Putin-Trump telephone call where Putin, the old KGB spy, master manipulator, will find ways of winning over Trump and sort of bringing him to accept conditions which will, weaken Ukraine if they're accepted. So major problems there. I think what the Europeans can and should be doing is looking how much more support they can give to Ukraine in the short term to show Russia that Ukraine has strong and committed allies, military support, economic support, but also what more pressure can be piled on Russia. And one interesting and rather encouraging point of the last few days is that at the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada yesterday, as we speak, Marco Rubio seemed to be willing to sign up to a communique which talked about more sanctions, more pressure on Russia if they don't sign up to a ceasefire, including things like an oil price cap, which would, of course, hit the Russian economy, very dependent on oil, and possibly using some of those frozen Russian assets to fund reconstruction. And that's the first time I've seen clear American commitment to put more pressure on Putin to bring him to the table. And I think that's exactly the right way to be doing it.
Is there a risk, though, with those Russian assets that we could instead scare Putin away from the negotiating table if he thinks coming to it could put them at risk of being taken away by Europe?
Well, I think we need to make clear to him that if he doesn't come and engage seriously in negotiations, his assets might be confiscated and sold for the benefit of Ukraine. Clearly, if he does engage in peace talks, then that won't happen. And indeed, I think the Americans would want to kind of bait the hook a bit with offers potentially of lifting some of the sanctions in due course if he plays a straight game in the ceasefire talks. So no, I mean we these sorts of threats of what we would do are also in a way an incentive for Putin to come to the table. There aren't that many incentives, I have to say, for Putin, who feels like he's winning the war in Ukraine, to come to the table and to talk seriously about a settlement which would allow Ukraine to continue to exist as a sovereign, independent country, deciding its own future. And it's really only strong arm American pressure with support from Europe that can give him that incentive, I think.
And on that, Keir Starmer has said that Vladimir Putin has to negotiate when he says sooner or later. Do you think Putin actually believes that?
Nobody knows. I mean, in the end, all wars do come to an end. Keir Starmer's right from that point of view. I think it's also right that the Russian economy is really hurting now, although it's not so obvious from the outside. I think it's very weakened inside. Almost all their government spending is going into the armed forces and the arms industry. I think the civilian economy is being starved of investment. Inflation's very high. They've taken terrible casualties. So at some point, yes, I think people around Putin have to start saying to him that you're not going to achieve your full objective and you need to find ways out of this. don't leave Russia humiliated, but which stop the fighting. I don't think Putin is there intellectually there as far as any one of us can judge. But it's quite right that at the end of the day, this has to come to an end, and the sooner the better.
Well, we've spoken a lot about Europe today, but meanwhile in America, Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, says he's cautiously optimistic about this ceasefire. Putin, he's laid out a lot of conditions. He's maybe not 100% behind this yet. The proposal put forward by the US and Ukraine. Is there actually this cause for optimism yet, or should we be watching really closely now what the Kremlin are saying?
I think it's diplomatic optimism. Marco Rubio and his boss are trying to create the circumstances where the two sides will come to the table and talk for the first time since the war of aggression by Russia broke out 3 years ago. And for that reason, I think he's got to try and sound positive, try and give the impression that things are moving forward. He doesn't want to put Putin in a corner. But I don't think there's any sign really that Putin is prepared to negotiate seriously. The kind of conditions that he was talking about yesterday were essentially Russia's opening position at the start of this war. They wanted to see a weak Ukraine, a Ukraine with limits on the size of its armed forces, not able to join NATO, no NATO troops on Ukrainian territory, Ukraine having to accept the secession, as it were, handing over to Russian sovereignty of the four eastern provinces, which would actually mean Ukraine retreating a bit from territory where they're still present at the moment. All of those, I think, are impossible demands to put on Zelensky, certainly collectively like that. So this does not sound like a serious preliminary to real negotiations, but a stalling tactic, while Putin hopes his forces can complete the job in the Kursk area where Ukraine has been occupying a chunk of Russia, but also playing for time because he thinks he's winning on the battlefield. So I don't see the reasons for the optimism that Marco Rubio talks about, but I can perfectly well understand why diplomatically he wants to give that impression.
Well, exactly, and on that playing for time idea, Steve Witkoff obviously went to Moscow to deliver these ceasefire proposals to Putin. He was then made to wait for something like 8 hours while Putin, put out this almost surprise foreign visit from Belarus and laid out Russia's position. How worried should we be really that Putin is just using this to play for time?
I mean, this is classic Putin technique, isn't it? It's to show who's the boss, to put the interlocutor coming to Moscow on the wrong foot, a bit of humiliation. It's a sort of power play out of the KGB playbook, I would say. And the Americans are finding out that negotiating with the Russians is not that simple. Trump talked about a solution on day one to this war. Well, he's finding out it's not going to be that. So, yes, I think Putin would regard an emissary from Washington as someone quite low down the food chain, and felt that uh, he could throw his weight around and make the guy wait and wait, and then put him after Lukashenko, the Belarus president, which is, I think, a deliberate piece of humiliation. So all of this is posturing, is maneuvering. He's desperate to show that he is not a demander for this. He's not playing from a position of weakness. He's in a position of strength, and if he deigns to join a negotiating table, well, then it will be because he expects to get all or most of his demands. It's the kind of thing you would expect from Putin. You remember his meetings with Emmanuel Macron in the run up to the war, sitting at that enormous long table with Macron about 50 yards away from him. I mean, he has all these tricks to show who is boss when people come to the Kremlin.
And we talk about those tricks, and you mentioned there Trump finding that the negotiations are maybe not as simple as he had said. He's even admitted recently that he was being what he calls a bit sarcastic about his claim that he could get the war ended in 24 hours. How much leeway or time do you think Trump is able to give Putin to come to a conclusion on whether or not he's going to come to the table?
Well, Trump has made no secret of the fact he wants an early end to the fighting. And I've always felt that he wants to have a ceasefire that he can declare as a famous victory. He, I think, has never been too bothered about what the detail of it is, or whether it would be sustainable, how it would be observed, monitored, what the consequences would be if one side violated the ceasefire. These are actually all points that Putin had brought up in the hope of muddying the waters and delaying the whole thing, tying it up in a lot of complicated knots. But I don't think that figures in Trump's thinking at all. He's just thinking it will be a declaration of ceasefire, handshakes in the Oval Office, and then off he goes to get the Nobel Peace Prize for achieving this remarkable turnaround. But that kind of ceasefire would last days, I think, probably at most, and would very rapidly fall apart. So, how long is he prepared to let this run? It's a very good question. He is so mercurial and unpredictable. He could suddenly take against Putin if he felt Putin was jerking him around and not taking him seriously. And we might find a bit as with Kim Jong Un, the North Korean leader. He went to Pyongyang. He hoped to land a big shiny deal. Didn't quite work out, and then he immediately veered away from Kim Jong Un, who became public enemy after that. And of course, Putin's trying to avoid that. But I suspect Trump's impatience at some point or other will predominate, and he will say, I've done my very best on this. If they don't want my support, well, then they can just sort it out between themselves and step back from the whole thing. Potentially also step back from supporting Ukraine. That's the concern, because then after all this flurry of activity, Ukraine could be left weaker than it was. Having to depend on European support at a time when the Europeans can't substitute for everything that the Americans are bringing to the table. So that's the worrying scenario: an impatient rejection of the whole thing, and America just pulling right back from the problem. That's not what any of us want to see, and I think that's why Keir Starmer is working so hard now to make sure that Trump knows that the Europeans are prepared to put serious resources, even including military, into this as part of trying to get a sustainable outcome.
And so that 100-day target that Trump laid out, should we be worried about that if we get to that 100-day target and Trump hasn't got a ceasefire?
I think the real target for Trump was probably the May the 8th commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, which is clearly going to be a big commemoration, particularly in Moscow, where this is the crucial moment of their myth, really, or their the national story that it was really Russia that beat the Nazis. And I think he'd probably hoped that there might be some grand signing ceremony, around May the 8th. If it drags out beyond there, then I think this factor of impatience and volatility in Trump could well push things the other way. I mean, I don't know, but I didn't. Having watched the first term, he quickly tires of something if he doesn't think there's anything directly in it for him in continuing to work on things, and that could well happen here as well. So there is a degree of urgency and there is a degree of momentum that actually Trump has generated. I mean, to give him credit for that, and I think that's why European leaders are working so hard, weekend after weekend, to try and um, develop some momentum on their side as well, to show Trump that it's not just between him and the Russians and the Ukrainians, but the Europeans also have a major role to play here. And Keir Starmer, to my mind, deserves a lot of credit for that, working with Emmanuel Macron, with his Jonathan Powell, his excellent national security advisor. I think they really have put Britain at the front of European efforts in this crisis.
And I want to talk briefly now about the situation on the ground in Ukraine and its impact on the negotiating situation. Um, Kursk and the salient the Ukrainians hold there is still crucial in this for all sides, it seems. Today, Zelensky has denied his forces there are defeated. Uh, but is it more conducive to ceasefire talks if Ukraine does withdraw from Russia? Or should Ukraine try now to bring whatever it can hold in Kursk to the negotiating table if it can get there?
My own feeling is that Zelensky's motive in pushing his forces into Russia, invading that part of Russia, holding the territory, was to give themselves a card in the negotiations, a bargaining counter in the negotiations, that he could bargain a pullout from Kursk against something else that he needed from Putin. And it looks to me like Putin is determined to take that bargaining chip away from him by completing the uh, operation to push out the Ukrainian forces to recover the Russian territory and therefore take that off the table. And I think that's part of why he is playing for time in this initial negotiation. He wants to get that military operation completed, hence his spectacle of arriving there in military uniform a couple of days ago. I think, therefore, that probably Zelensky's gamble in pushing that operation forward is failing. Um, it did put the Russians under some pressure for a while, but Ukraine has not been able to hold the ground. And it looks to me like by the time any serious negotiation gets going, the incursion into the Kursk area will be over. So I don't think he will any longer hold that bargaining card.
On the other side of that, though, Zelensky has said that Ukrainian forces have managed to stabilize the lines around Pokrovsk in Ukraine's east. Um, is it important from a negotiating standpoint that Ukraine is able to stop Russia from reaching those official borders of the eastern Donbass region?
Yes, I think it is. I think if the Russians were able to push the Ukrainians back so that they, uh, in practice, occupied all those four eastern provinces, which they actually say and I think have written into their constitution are now part of Russia, that again puts Putin in a rather more favorable position in the negotiations. If the front line, effectively, the line of separation in a ceasefire becomes the frontier of those four provinces. At the moment, they are not all controlled by Russia, and therefore the Ukrainians can say it's completely out of the question that they should accept any kind of Russian sovereignty over those provinces. So it's another of those tactical issues in the run up to a ceasefire. Yes, more generally, I think it is very much in all our interest that Ukraine should be moving forward in some parts of this grinding First World War style battle at the time of the ceasefire negotiations, because inevitably, if Russia feels it's gradually grinding the Ukrainians down, it's making kilometer by kilometer progress, taking towns and villages from time to time, there is then less incentive for them to settle for a ceasefire. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for really doing all we can in the short term to give the Ukrainians the arms, the missiles, the ammunition they need to try to get a bit of momentum going on the battlefield, which will then play into the negotiations.
And just finally, Peter, I wanted to ask you about the role of the UK's National Security Advisor, a role, of course, you will know well, Jonathan Powell, in all of this. He's a political veteran of Britain's Tony Blair government, and he's actually played quite a big role in getting talks to the point they're at now, hasn't it? It looks now that his selection by Keir Starmer was quite an inspired choice for that role.
I agree. I wouldn't have expected it because, of course, he was not a civil servant. He was outside the government, but his 10 years of experience working for Tony Blair as his chief of staff makes him the most experienced person in Number 10 at the moment in the way central government works. He's made his whole career around negotiation and mediation, famously in the Northern Ireland peace talks, but ever since then as well in the consultancy he's run. So he really is a foremost exponent of what's happening now, low key, hardworking, creative moves to try to bring two deeply opposed sides to a table and get them to talk. That is what Jonathan is best at. His profile is very suited to that. He's not somebody who ever seeks the limelight. He's got a nice self-deprecating manner, a bit of humor, highly professional, and he's clearly got the full confidence of Keir Starmer. So the Starmer Jonathan Powell duo, one doing the top level public facing job, the other in the back rooms, constantly on a plane between Kiev and Washington and keeping all the parties engaged. I think it's proved to be a very, very successful combination. I mean, there are other things he needs to do as well as National Security Advisor. He needs to run the National Security Council, make sure that the government is looking at other things than the Ukraine crisis. But in this crisis, I think he's absolutely been the right man in the right job. And I think Keir Starmer has shown, he is a good crisis leader. Perhaps wasn't apparent in his first 8 months in government, but it seems to me his reputation, certainly around Europe, has really been boosted by the way he's played the last 2 or 3 weeks.
And so how would you say that speaks to Keir Starmer and the wider UK's ability to use soft power on the world stage?
Well, I think this crisis has reminded people that the Brits are good at crisis managing, good at convening, getting people to London, negotiating, finding common ground, finding practical ways forward when everything seems to be blocked. And so I think it's reminded people that after the Brexit years, Britain is absolutely central to European security. It is experienced, it does have ideas, and it has a good diplomacy. And I think there's been another factor, has been working very closely with the French. I think Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer seem to have a very good relationship. The British and French are the two main military forces in Europe, and working together, it's a powerful combination. We're coming down the line now, of course, is the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who is also a strong pro-Ukraine, pro-defense operator, who is going to massively increase German defense spending. So there's a prospect of that trio playing a central role in guiding Europe in not just in response to the Ukraine war, but in the new realization that Europe's got to do a great deal more now to prepare for its own security and defense, because neither Trump nor any likely successor is going to make the kind of commitment that has been in Europe from America throughout my 40-year career.
Lord Peter Ricketts, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.